Welcome back to Composition and its Allies. My name is Barney. I'm a classical composer, and this is a channel for composers as well as performers that are interested in composition. Orchestration for Beginners is for anyone who wants to compose and orchestrate their first orchestral work. I actually had to move to Paris, France. I stayed there for 5 years to properly learn harmony, as well as taking some orchestration classes, but it's really the harmony that allowed me to reorchestrate my first symphony, help with for orchestra, without needing a teacher. In today's video, I want to expose some of the problems with orchestration teaching in America and show you instead what actually works. Let's begin. I want to do a quick disclaimer because I wouldn't want to cause undue offense. So if my vehement critiques of education in America should cause you to feel unwell, then please send me an address where I can send you a box of tissues. Okay, so good stuff in America. There are things that are really good. And though the problems are quite grave, as we say in French, the good stuff is still so good, I still think it might be worth it to study in America. So in America, we're very composition-centric. So you're going there really for composition, not for technique. You're getting a lot of performances of your music. I've talked about this in a lot more detail in the Orchestration in America versus Orchestration in France video, as well as a recent Composition for Beginners video, but I cannot emphasize enough that there are a lot of skills that you get as a composer that you won't get through Écriture musicale. Écriture musicale is what I promote heavily on this channel for the technique, harmony exercises above and below, orchestration in the French style. That's all really great, but Écriture musicale is there to guide you, it's to shape you. So think of it like you're the master, you're the king or the queen, okay, the emperor, the empress, and you have this vision, and then you have an équipe. In French, you have a team that's there to serve you. So the Écriture musicale is there to really guide you and to give you options, like which doublings do I want, which inversion do I want, which voicing. Like it gives you a lot of options on the table, so you can choose the best of the best of the best. But you still need that vision, that direct experience of composing your own music, not Mozart's music, but your own music in your own style. That's very difficult. And if you study in America, you definitely will get that. So what is tuition in America? Well, I think it varies depending on the school, depending on the state. But I think, $20,000 a year is, pretty good. Okay. 25,000 a year. Okay. That's like pretty good. And keep in mind, for musicians, many times we have to go out of state because you're going for a specific teacher. So it's kind of expected you're going to have the out of state expense, not to mention the housing costs associated with the food costs. So over the course of 4 years, I think we're really looking at $100,000. So for $100,000, I think we can ask some questions. I actually think that $100,000 is quite a bargain because you're going to get 2 or 3 concerts per year. You have lots of chamber opportunities. You're going to be able to write for a lot of different people. If you were to do this outside of a system, you would have to pay for it. So imagine finding the professionals, getting that amount of rehearsals. So I think it is quite a good deal when you actually look at like what it would cost to pay to have that. Not to mention like percussion. How do you pay for percussion? In the college, it's already there on campus. My last year of college, I actually composed a wind ensemble piece that I used to get into grad school. And the wind ensemble didn't perform my music. I just had to organize it with the musicians I knew. But luckily, I'd been taking classes with people. I was friends with a lot of people. I'd worked with a lot of people because I also play tuba. So I was able to organize it, just one rehearsal. And I had a pizza party to incentivize people. But through my college, I was able to get this done. And you can only imagine the expense it would incur outside of college trying to finance that on your own. So for $100,000, I do think education in America for composition is bien mérité, it's French, well deserved. So let's talk about instrumentation. I haven't talked much about instrumentation on this channel for a couple of reasons. One, it doesn't generally interest me, and rather focus me because I'm actually interested, so the passion sticks out. I also think instrumentation information about it is quite abundant and very good, very accurate, so I don't know if I can really add that much more to the conversation. Instrumentation is how you write for the instruments. So it's learning to write well for the instruments, so it's natural. You don't want something that's too difficult or just not idiomatic where it's just awkward and uncomfortable to play. What I find many times is when there's animosity between performers and composers, like the performer turns against their piece or hates the piece, hates the experience. A lot of times it's because the writing is just too awkward and they sound awful and they hate how it sounds. It's not worth all the effort. So you do need to learn instrumentation so that you can write well for the instruments. However, instrumentation is not going to be orchestration. So some general tendencies, we'll start with the strings. Fast scale-like passages tend to work really well. Arpeggios work really well if they're in the right keys. Learning about the double stops. Strings are very versatile. Learning the ranges as well. The different sound. Okay, so for example, for the violins, they're the most versatile of all the instruments. They can play really well in the high register. Low register is really dark and rich. When it comes to the double basses are very tricky because it's slower to speak. You have to write at a lower level than you would for the violins. It's something you have to learn. Also, keep in mind, historically, double bass was, less people played it. The standards are much lower. So if you're not ready for a professional ensemble, you will encounter like a lot of difficulties if you don't have the best players. When it comes to cellos, they're extremely versatile, almost as versatile as the violins. When it comes to viola, it's the middle voice. So again, it's like technically they can do just as much as the violins, but in practice, a lot of schools, the level of the violas is not the same as other departments. But my school, I don't need to hear about your exception. Okay, this is a general tendency that you'll encounter when you're composing. When it comes to brass, I think I can speak especially accurately only because I was a brass player. Tuba was my first instrument, and I've played in youth orchestra. I played in brass ensemble, quintet, all the different, even jazz ensembles. So I have quite a diverse experience as a brass player. Generally with brass, the biggest thing is the breathing, okay? The breathing, they need time to breathe. If you don't give them time to breathe, they're still going to have to breathe. Like physically, it's impossible. And you're going to hear disruptions in your music. So you have to either be willing to accept that or better to just anticipate where the breath is going to take. It just takes time. A lot of composers, when they're at the piano, when you're in your abstract place, you think, oh, it should be doable, and it's actually not doable. Tuba has quite a large register, but generally for the orchestra, it's the D and the staff and below is where you're going to stick maybe the C below, because when it goes above, gorgeous tone, beautiful tone, but it's very soloistic sounding. So it's going to be very distracting unless you're actually using it for a solo. When it comes to trumpet, they're very versatile, but you have to be careful about cracking notes. Be careful of the high register. You usually have to prepare a high note by a distinctive interval, like a rising perfect fourth, or getting by a scale. Otherwise, there's just a high propensity that they're going to crack the note, and then the performer gets anxious about that, and they get uptight, and you don't have a good performance. When it comes to trombone, they're actually quite versatile because they have the slide so they can get tuning, but it means you also have to be careful with quick passages because it's just hard to get to the right position very accurately, so you're going to have to write a little bit slower for the trombones. French horns, you have to be really careful because they tend to crack notes a lot. They're very, very, even professional performers, you will hear another thing about brass is that they can do double tonguing very easily, okay, on single notes. Okay, even scales they can do pretty well, but it depends on the fingering. Be really careful of arpeggios, because for brass we have to use the same fingering generally for the arpeggios. It means our lips have to go up and down, so it's very hard to do very quickly. Woodwinds, thing about woodwinds is each instrument is so different from the other, and each of them has like ranges that sound great and others that are really weak and maybe beautiful, but just don't have a lot of projection power. So that is a difficulty. So it would be nice if you had some experience with all the woodwinds before you compose for orchestra. At least, if you could have at least two. So flutes are the most versatile. They can kind of do anything. I never really worry about, the playability of my flute parts. The level is very high. Every town you're going to find a flautist. So it's just a lot of competition. I find I don't really have to think too much about what I'm writing. I always get a little hesitant with arpeggios, okay? So, maybe consult an orchestration book, but flutes I don't really worry about too much. Oboe is very difficult to write for because they only have a very small range where it's like the most natural place. And I think composers are not used to restriction. It's kind of like writing for a vocal instrument. Lowest range gets really honky and it's not always pleasant, though I actually like it and I use it a lot in my symphony. But upper range, above the staff, it gets weak, it's thin, it's hard to project. So you're kind of like restricted to this tender region, but it sounds really good. But that means when you're composing for the oboe, you can't just compose that piano and then hear the oboe after. You have to already imagine and see where it's going to be placed in the staff for the oboist so that it actually sounds good. Clarinets are extremely versatile, almost as versatile as the flutes. They also have great projection power in their lower register versus the flutes that don't. Medium register is very good, very flexible. There's a little area, towards the bottom of the staff, it just has a dull register. I found if I write something that gets to forte there, I don't like the sound, doesn't matter how good the clarinetist is. These are things that you discover when you do instrumentation, okay, or when you're composing your own pieces. We'll have a clarinet, you'll get very sensitive. Where the forte works, a higher register of the clarinets, they can't really do piano. Okay, so knowing where that break is. But otherwise, from a technique aspect, I don't feel that limited with the clarinets. Bassoons are quite difficult to write for. Generally, orchestration contexts, they're going to be used, in the staff or below, because when they go above, it's quite soloistic. It's very tender. And even like standard bassoon writing, I find it's just difficult to do well, but that could just be me. So notice how I went for that rather quickly, because I'm not seeking to give a comprehensive tutorial on instrumentation, because the information out there is quite excellent. A lot of times when you look up orchestration, you will find that it's actually instrumentation. So if you need more information on instrumentation, you could there are many other videos that could do a much better job. I encourage you to consult that, but just keep in mind that is not orchestration. All right, let's talk about how colleges teach orchestration. So like I've posited a number of times in this channel, it generally is not orchestration, okay? Sometimes, but Mark, I don't need to hear about your very, very unique exception. The vast majority of times, these classes are going to be score analysis or instrumentation in disguise. Certain colleges do offer opportunities where you get to actually write and hear your piece workshop, but I'm not very familiar with that, and that is definitely not the norm. But let's talk about orchestration classes that are actually instrumentation classes. So my experience is that they're highly effective for learning instrumentation, not orchestration, but they are done very well in America. So $100,000, I do think you're getting a very good deal here. So many times, the actual implementation will be different, but many times there'll be a student performer that's invited, and each week or every other week or once a month there'll be a different performer, and the professor will lead discussions and ask what works. They'll probably present some of the pieces they're working on. They'll talk about what makes it difficult, and hopefully the composers, they definitely will pay attention. And it's generally a really nice experience. You'll also form a bond with the performer, and you might want to work with them, and it's just a great way to meet people, a great way to learn. Okay, generally the composers will compose small excerpts or pieces for this performer, and then in a future session they'll test it out. So nothing to complain there. Definitely, it's great. $100,000, definitely very worth it. A problem I find though, $100,000. Problem I find is that many times there's sight reading. Because keep in mind that performer, they are there for their teacher. They are specifically for the teacher. They have a repertoire that's really important. They have an end of year recital they're probably getting ready for. That's the most important. That all their energy is going to that. So they're not going to really have time to practice music just for a class. If you compose a piece for them, they might have some time, but definitely just for one class, a reading, you have to just make sure it's sight readable. I think some light improvements that you could do for this format, because it's kind of a bummer if they're just sight reading and not, they're making mistakes that are just literally because of sight reading, not because it's not well written, is you could have really short excerpts. Okay, I'm going to do, let's say I'm writing for clarinet, I'm going to have a 10-second excerpt where I experiment with key clicks, or I'm going to have a 15-second excerpt where I focus on arpeggios, just testing it, just truly just testing. Not so much compositionally, your musical ideas, but just technique, what works. I have a hunch this works, try different things, what keys. I think if it was a little more planned in that way, and the professor really encouraged that, and you had okay, 5 to 7 excerpts, try different techniques, maybe it could even be guided in certain cases, it doesn't have to be. I think that'll be very effective, and it's more likely the clarinetist could give really direct feedback, because it's not really the composition they're looking at, they're just truly looking at technique. Keep in mind, performers can be very scared to give any kind of critique to composers, because unfortunately there have been instances of composers getting very offended, or just, putting themselves on the pedestal. It's not always the case, but it can be the case. Or they're just kind of brought up to be very respectful and give composers a chance. But you really, as much as possible, you want to get direct feedback. And if something is not well written, you want to know, because you want to learn to adapt to the instrument. It is not the case that you're just composing in the void and everyone adapts to you. It's just not possible. Okay, why do you think Bach chose the keys he did for the harpsichord? Because it's it's playable in those keys. It doesn't have that many black keys, right? Because they're harder to reach. So you have to, as much as possible, learn to actually write well for these instruments, and this is instrumentation. This is not orchestration. I think a big improvement to these classes is one I've been harping over very much lately, and it's grades. Okay, so there should be actual grades, aka actual accountability. So you may remember a recent video I did called Orchestration in America versus Orchestration in France. I'm not going to go into all the details, but work needs to be graded. Okay, it cannot just be you get an easy A. A is the best grade you can get in America. And one of the things you could do is you could have a rubric. Okay, this is something that other departments do. Like if you're writing an essay in America, definitely in high school I had rubrics and the teacher was following, criteria. It's not just their feeling, like it's something there. Now, I had a recent competition here at Competition with Allies, an orchestration competition, and we do have a winner, but not quite time to announce it because I'm still preparing the video and reviewing the piece and making samples and stuff like that. But we do have a winner. But to do this competition, I said it can't just be my random feelings. It has to be something tangible. So you can look at it for yourself at barngmusic.com/orchestration. It's still up there, even though the competition is closed. I have a rubric. So even if it's not perfect, it's something objective that we can use to evaluate, so it's not just an overall impression. So in terms of making improvements to orchestration classes in America that are really instrumentation classes in disguise, you could have actual grades. And of course, you need some kind of measure. It can't just be an overall feeling. It has to be something tangible like a rubric. Okay. And it would be graded by, in my opinion, it would make sense to grade it by the student performer because they're the ones meeting with the composers. Okay. Also the professor of the student performer, because they're the official expert at the school, the professor of clarinet, they would know best, like, is this well written? And the professor, of course, of the orchestration classes, okay? So maybe 3 different grades, and then you combine them all. I don't know how you want to do it. Now, obviously, it would take time. It's a little bit difficult, but it could be done. Some of the things you could look at, what is poor writing, what is excellent writing, and just have some kind of model. So here is a model. If this is an example of poor writing, here is an example of acceptable writing, and here is an example of excellent writing, okay? Obviously, it would take time and effort, okay? But I think for $100,000, this would be a reasonable expectation to have that you're going into a class where there is grades, your work matters, and that there's some clear, fair rubric in place. Now, I have to admit, like with a rubric, it still can be subjective, but as much as possible that you have something tangible that we are working towards. But of course, the overall problem is that this is not orchestration, this is instrumentation because you're focused on one instrument, and when you're composing for orchestra, you're focused on many instruments together. So now I want to talk about what actually gets you ready for orchestration. So instrumentation, very nice. It is critical because you need to know how to write for the instruments, but it is not orchestration. Score analysis, which I talked about in a recent video, quite nice, but it doesn't give you the real skills that you need for orchestration. Before I do so, I just want to mention we have a French harmony exercise series that brings that knowledge that I got in France. I moved there, I was there for 5 years, and I brought this knowledge, translated to English, and made it more adaptable for fugue and orchestration. So we have guide tutorials up, which will become paid, though right now they're free just to get started. And I also have study guide tutorials we'll be able to work through for free and to learn actual harmony by doing, not by intellectual. So you can check it out on school.com/composition. Skill number 1, you need to be able to place the bass. Hear the bass and place the bass. So in this excerpt from my symphony, notice that I have that bass. It's not just one note, it's actually 3 notes that kind of form that bass identity, and that's in the trombones for the brass. I also have it in the strings, cellos and violas. Okay, so I had to hear what octave is it in, like which notes. It's not just the lowest note here, it's kind of, it forms a unit together, and which instruments, also which doublings, if they're going to be a unison, which parts is going to be shared on. These are actual skills I needed to orchestrate. Now, some secondary considerations. Notice that for the strings, I have non divisi because I really wanted that gruff, aggressive tone. But yes, that is important. But I find a lot of times when people do score study, they're focused on those techniques, but they're not actually looking at the harmony, which is coming prior. So if you're studying orchestration, like an American style or instrumentation or score study, how are you going to be ready for orchestration when this skill of just placing the bass, what instrument it's going to be, what octave it's going to be, what doubling is part of the bass, if you don't have any experience doing that in orchestration context, I do not see how it'll be ready when you go to orchestrate, and you're just going to feel really lost. Now we also have to place the upper, so we have the outer voices. This is directly from harmony, because in harmony, French harmony exercises, you have a soprano exercise, you have the melody, you hear the bass. And you got to fill in those middle voices. Or you have the bass exercise, you hear the bass, you got to hear the top voice, make it très joli, in French, very beautiful, and get those middle voices while often testing the middle voices as you go. So this skill of hearing the outer voices, this basic way of hearing harmonically, it comes really, it's indispensable when it comes to orchestration. So we got the bass, now we got to place the upper voices, okay? So what octave is it going to be in, which partial of the chords, they're all very different, and you have to be able to hear what you want. So for the strings notes, I have it in the violin 1 and 2. Notice the use of unisons. So when you have a wide distance you want to fill, you probably won't need unisons. But here I have a smaller distance that I definitely want to be in, so I have to figure out which note are they sharing. Also, another thing is what register. So notice that the highest note is B here. Theory, I could have had a high F sharp, but when I was listening, I didn't want the high F sharp, and I didn't want the F sharp below. I wanted that exact note, that exact B, that exact register. Okay. Likewise with the woodwinds. Notice I confirm the height of the chord, so I still have that high B. Okay, so that's consistent across both groups. It could be the case, you'll see with Beethoven, the strings will have their highest note, and the woodwinds will have their highest note. Oftentimes it's this violin 1 that will dominate. But again, if you're not doing this in your orchestration class, how are you going to be ready to orchestrate on your own? I don't see how it's possible. Okay, so notice I have chose the clarinets and the flutes. So why the clarinets and flutes? Why not the oboes? So notice the pairing of the clarinets and flutes with the brass, with the violins and the other strings. Also notice the use of unisons between clarinet and flute. So these are things, harmonic skills and just basic listening that come through harmony exercises that if you have no real experience, you can't just learn it last second. Okay, so instrumentation is great. Okay, it's nice, it's great, it is indispensable, but it's not going to be enough to get you for orchestration and score analysis. We're not even getting into that right now. Another thing is reading soprano clef. So notice the clarinet, okay? And something to know, I've talked about it sometimes, but I'll say it again, is generally for B-flat instruments, the way you would transpose, just think down a second. But in certain cases, you will have to actually read them in a soprano clef, because the main key is going to be in sharps, but to notate it in sharps for the B-flat instruments, there will be way too many sharps, so they revert to a flat key, whatever, it doesn't matter. But basically, though typically we read down a second, sometimes you're going to have to read down a third, in which we use the soprano clef. We also use soprano clef for clarinet A, but here it's a clarinet B-flat that uses the soprano clef. So this is a difficulty, because you have to be able to know what notes you're writing and hearing it, but there's always a little hiccup. It takes time. Very few of us have amazing pitch that we can just know. So this is something you get trained for. So if your orchestration class is just focused on talking about the genius of Ligeti, oh, it's so amazing. Yeah, it's good to know, but I need to orchestrate, and being able to read fluently in soprano clef, or at least being able to get in shape real quick. I feel like we get a little, you get a little sloppy in our technique, but you can get in shape very quickly when you have to do it. Another thing is solfege classes. I probably should do another video on the problem of solfege classes. I've talked about it several times. I'll just give my blunt opinion, and then I'll try to qualify it. But I'm just going to say it bluntly. The overwhelming majority of solfege classes in America are a waste of time. A waste of time. That is the nicest way I can actually put it, because I understand on paper, when you're designing a curriculum, you think, okay, we need to have ear training, we have to have solfege. It makes perfect sense. But in practice, what often happens, the teacher that does solfege is a part-time teacher, adjunct, not getting paid much, so they're running around all the different types of jobs, so not that focused on the job. The class is undervalued, the teacher might get pressure from other professors to give out nice grades, the kids come late, they don't take it seriously, there's no real grades. okay? But what I've seen very consistently is solfege classes in America are many times a joke. But my solfege, I don't need to hear about your one individual case or a couple cases. Many times they're just really not taking that seriously, so it ends up being wasted time. It could be more productively used if you wanted to, $100,000. Now, what could make it more useful? Well, one of the problems is you will probably learn soprano clef in a solfege class. But what are they going to do? They're going to have you jumping all over the staff, these crazy leaps that you will never, ever encounter in the vast majority of music, so it's divorced from reality. I understand there's a reasoning maybe that it actually gets you in shape. I'd like to see real proof of that because it's something intellectually that seems to make sense. Could we see real proof? Like, is there a real study that I can actually look at it and verify for myself that it actually gets you ready? Because just jumping around from all these different notes, all these crazy leaps, I don't see how it's really worth the time because it's very difficult. And when it comes to actual orchestration, look at this clarinet part. Notice it's very logical writing. So I do need to know soprano clef, but clearly it's not in these high places off the staff and not these crazy leaps. Skill number 3, middle voices. So French horns are the savior. They are so important when it comes to orchestration. So if you have no experience with writing for French horns and you're orchestrating, good luck. But I would just do some light study of basic, romantic composers and just look at the French horn parts, how they're written. So notice on the screen here, we have the treble voices and I have the bass voices, okay? And notice how the French horns are binding the two together. This is where harmony classes become really important because in harmony, you're learning the outer voices, soprano and bass, but then you learn how to bring those middle voices. There are rules about distances between the outer voices, between the inner voices, so you learn when you can have tight spacing, when you can use stretch spacing, and of course when you go to orchestrate, it's very different on paper because there's more voices, but the basic principles of 4-part voice leading are pretty much there, and you also get that ear training to hear the doublings that you want and the spacings that you want. Skill number 4, connecting 2 phrases. So notice in this enchaînement, so in French, in this kind of connection between 2 phrases, it doesn't really work in English, okay, but this kind of, connection, enchaînement, the clarinet jumps to the C sharp, C sharp. So in a boring voice leading, I could have kept it the same. Now, you need to learn harmony because for the vast majority of the time, I wouldn't call it boring voice leading in most cases. It's just like, you keep the same notes in common, you move by step, or you leap as little as possible, but it just makes the music way easier to understand. It just allows you to focus on bigger things. But sometimes when you orchestrate, you actually want something a little bit more flavor that actually says something, okay? So notice clearly, I could have kept the clarinet on the same note, but it sounds boring to me. I don't like it. I want a fundamental shift here, so I have it leaping to its next note. Likewise with the violin. Okay, so notice the violin leaping to its note. This is actually going to feel melodic because they're definitely suck up a lot of attention. So this is obviously something very intentional. But if you do not have experience with proper voice leading, then it's going to be hard to hear this alternate voice leading that might be attracting your ear. Notice I tried, if I kept on the same note, I don't like it. It's kind of boring. Okay. Also, this other option, I put the C sharp on top. I tested. I don't like how it sounds. So this kind of subtlety of hearing, what voicing do I want? What register do I want? What doubling, the voicing I want? All of that is coming through harmonic training. So if you're studying in America, hoping to get ready for orchestration, and it's not being addressed, then we're gonna have some problems. If you have not orchestrated today, please get to work, shut off YouTube, and get to orchestrating, get to composing right now. If you have already done so and you would like to get better at harmony, so you can get better at orchestration, you can head over to school.com/composition. Have a good day.